Welcome aboard! This is a video about how I made an epoxy chart countertop for my boat. I cut the wood, printed the chart, epoxied over it, and installed it. Zero problems, zero setbacks, the perfect project. I'm just kidding. This is me taking a blowtorch to my table, this is me taking an angle grinder to my table, and this is the head that my epoxy chart countertop is supposed to cover. I'm JakeSea, and in this video, I'm going to be doing something different than any of my other videos. I'm going to be making something with the goal of improving my boat. And maybe teaching something in the process. Whether that be teaching how to or not to do something will be left up to you. If this entertains you, then be sure to let me know by liking and subscribing, and I will attempt to make more stuff. I personally enjoy it, but everything I do doesn't have to be on the internet. In this video, I'll be making a hinged epoxy chart countertop to extend my sink space and cover the head on my boat. As you can see, the current arrangement has some room for improvement. First thing first, I need to figure out how large the gap I am trying to fill is. Lucky for me, the gap in question is already set up to support a counter, so all I have to do is measure what exists. This is a step specific to me and unimportant to you, but I want to ensure two things while doing this. One is that I would clear the rack I have mounted on the wall. This counter is going to be hinged, so it needs to be able to move freely up. And two, that the final product is the same thickness as the existing counter, so that it'll be level with it. Since I knew I would be pouring epoxy, I needed my plywood base to be thinner than the wood that the cabinetry is made of. With the cabinetry being 3/4 of an inch, I got 1/2 inch of plywood, cut and in hand. I did one final test fitting before starting the actual project, which I would need two things to start: epoxy and a chart, both of which are easy to come by. Nobody really uses charts anymore, but you can find them at any local boat outfitter, or you can do what I did and make a custom chart on Noah's website. After downloading my chart, I then took it to Photoshop for some custom details. And as for the epoxy, I decided to go with Home Depot's tabletop epoxy. I did this for a number of reasons. The first being that it wasn't overly expensive compared to lots of other epoxies I was finding. And another, and more important reason, is that it seemed easy to use and was not deep pour epoxy. This meant that I didn't need to build a jig to pour into. It also meant that I didn't really need to know what I was doing to use it. This would be a good time to mention that if you think you can do a better job than me, you probably can. So instead of trashing me in the comments, upload your own video. I'll watch it and comment on yours instead. Now that we have our chart and our wood cut, it is time to pass the point of no return and start epoxying things. But first, I made sure that my work area was clean-ish. Anything dirty in the work area is going to end up in the wet epoxy, so be sure to clean up. I also wanted to do some tests on the paper and wood first to figure out how the epoxy would pour. These tests revealed to me that I needed the chart laminated to protect the paper, and through observation combined with the instructions, I would need about 3 coats of epoxy combined with the 1/2 inch of wood to reach my 3/4 inch thickness that I was looking for. Armed with a plan, I taped off the table I would be working on. I also taped off the edges of the wood to create a holding area for the epoxy, and I started leveling. To foreshadow my future disasters, these two steps end up being the most important for the success and failure of my project. Making sure you have a solid tape seal and a level pour is critical. But now that everything's clean and I am all taped off and ready to go, I start mixing the epoxy together. This epoxy in particular is called glaze coat, and it's 2 parts mixed 1-to-1. I didn't have a problem with the working time on this epoxy. Mixing them slowly is the best method to get a uniform, clear, finished product. However, I did not mix them slowly because I'm impatient, but it didn't really affect my results. If you haven't gathered it yet, you soon will. This is a do as I say video and not a do as I do video, especially when it comes to personal protective equipment, wear a mask, be in a ventilated area, don't wear sandals, etc. Now, once my epoxy was mixed, I started working on my first pour. Well, technically my second pour. I already did the bottom of the chart to practice and it came out great. I'll show you how I ruined that later. But I did the back to divide up the 3 coats I would need, 1 for the back and 2 for the front. This gives the back a protective layer as well as sandwiches the wood for looks. Once the epoxy had been mixed, I took a foam roller and I painted a thin layer of epoxy onto the bare wood. This was my glue layer. I then laid the chart over it in order to get it to adhere to the wood. Once centered, I used a spreader to get all the air out and have the chart be flat. My reasoning for this layer was so that when I cut any excess epoxy off the table later, the chart itself is attached to the wood and not only sealed in epoxy. Then, without waiting, I poured the rest of the epoxy onto the chart and leveled it with the same spreader to help gravity out a bit. Next, it's time for you to fight the bubbles. The bubbles mostly form when stirring the 2 parts together, another reason to go slow. But I actually think that this epoxy does a really good job of limiting bubbles, and they tend to disappear on their own for the most part, but you can get the rest out with a heating tool. Or if you're me, your brand new heating tool that you bought for this project burns out right when you pour your first layer. And in case you're wondering why I'm not using this tool's government name, it's because YouTube's monetization and guidelines don't like a certain word that starts with a G. Anyways, after a lot of panic cursing, my girlfriend came into the rescue with a blow dryer. However, if you have the option, I would avoid this as the fan on a blow dryer is a lot stronger and can ripple the epoxy. And for the record, I have since replaced my heat tool with a new identical one and it is working fine. So this video doesn't have to be a bad review of Wagner anymore. I was prepared, and apologies for the pun, to roast them after how upset I was. Continuing on, this is where everything goes downhill. Remember how I said that I messed up the bottom? Well, after I let that first layer dry, I returned 5 hours later with not a new heat tool but a blowtorch, and while I'm trying to not burn the house down, some sneaky epoxy starts leaking through the tape barrier. I caught it, but it was too late. This is where the problems start to dogpile on top of each other. The tape had weakened from my first pour and due to an unlevel surface had piled up on that edge. As it poured out, I lost my layer of epoxy. I retaped the area and all the other areas around the entire piece. I tried to re-level the board, and I poured more epoxy into the now thin opposing side of the project. However, this later addition of epoxy either wasn't mixed well or took a bit too much fire from the torch as it came out a little yellow the next day. In fact, the entire torch idea was a waste of time because while it did help get some bubbles, it often just died out due to the angle it was being used at. Anyways, the worst came when I removed the tape and realized that the project had attached itself to the trash bags and microfiber towels. It now had a very large tumor attached to that perfect bottom that I had made days prior, ruining all my joy. At this point, I thought I was going to have to sand everything off and restart, maybe take the project to a large planer to level everything out. Before I gave up on what I had though, I got to sanding. And before long, I realized I would rather be grinding. And that worked great, turning what was once dust into smoke, until I made a mistake and I grinded a little too hard. But instead of letting what was my fourth or fifth huge mistake get me down, I remembered Bob Ross and turned my accident into a happy accident. I grinded around the rest of the border of the project and, with my epoxy tumor now gone, had a recovered countertop. I then took the entire project to a friend who helped me trim the excess epoxy back down to size. With new clean edges and a revived spirit, it was now a lot easier to see how the thickness of the table varied by side. Due to the unlevel setup and tape dam fiasco, one side of the counter was thinner than the other. Lucky for me, the thicker side was the perfect width to align with the existing counter, and I decided it was not worth planing and re-epoxying the entire project. Instead, I continued onward by beveling the edges to 1/4 round. Nobody wants to bump into a sharp corner on a boat. Cut the hinge to size and trimmed it to shape, and took my remaining epoxy and painted layers around the edges with a foam brush to reseal the wood I had cut. After a couple days of painting one layer at a time, the wood had a nice epoxy coat on it and the counter was ready for installation. I took the time to make sure it was all lined up properly, and with a special 90-degree drill accessory, I mounted the hinge and counter. Once mounted, I knew it would shake and bounce underway, so I found the special double-action bolt latch that would allow me to lock the counter in the down position against the teak support. And also, it would extend further to lock it against the bulkhead in the up position. Then, all that was left was for me to install the new poop curtains to hide the head from view. I made the poop curtain rod out of a spare piece of teak, cut it, and sanded it to shape. Ta-da! A new chart counter, all for about $200. With a surprise newspaper included for when it's time to conduct business. Once again, if you like this new style of video, let me know. I'm thinking about testing out a new boat floor product next. Smooth sailing.